Margaret Prescott had lived alone for 13 years in the house her husband built with his bare hands. It stood on the edge of a quiet coastal town in Maine, weathered by time, salt, and solitude. The clapboard siding had faded from a once proud blue to a storm-washed gray. The garden was now a tangle of wildflowers and ivy, and the attic, once full of life, now whispered with the voices of memory. Margaret had been 70 for just a few weeks, but age had stopped feeling like a number after 65. It felt more like a hush, a slow slipping into the shadows where people forgot to look. Every morning began the same. A cup of tea in the rocking chair by the window, wrapped in the same shawl her husband once bought for her at a market in Spain. The kettle whistled like a gentle reminder that she still had time, still had breath, still had choice. And yet, most days, she didn't choose much beyond surviving the hours ahead. She had once been an artist. Not famous, not even particularly known outside of her community, but her hands had held brushes like they were extensions of her soul. After her husband's passing, she'd locked her paints away. It felt too raw to create in a world where he no longer existed. The room that had once been her studio became a storage space. For grief, for silence, for all the things she no longer dared to feel. Then one afternoon, something broke the monotony. Letter. Not an email, not a phone call. An actual letter in careful handwriting, sealed with a floral stamp. It was from Eloise, her first best friend from college, a woman she hadn't spoken to in nearly 40 years. "I found a painting of yours at a thrift shop in Portland," the letter read. "It stopped me cold. I knew it had to be you. I'm visiting Maine next month. I'd love to see you again. If you're willing." Margaret read it 3 times before she set it down. Then she didn't touch it again for days. Something about it felt dangerous. Not the kind of danger that comes from harm, the kind that comes from hope. When Eloise arrived a few weeks later, Margaret stood frozen on the porch. The wind caught her cardigan and lifted it behind her like a flag. She hadn't prepared a meal or cleaned the house. She hadn't done her hair. But Eloise didn't notice or didn't care. She hugged her like time had folded in on itself. That afternoon, they talked like the decades hadn't stretched between them. They walked the edge of the bluff behind the house, laughed about things they thought they'd forgotten, and sat under the apple tree that had grown crooked with age, much like the two of them. Eloise didn't ask about the grief. She didn't need to. She saw it in the way Margaret held her tea, in the careful words she chose, in the subtle ache beneath her smile. "Do you still paint?" Eloise asked as they watched the sea, now golden with the setting sun. Margaret shook her head. "I haven't in over a decade." Eloise didn't push. But when she left the next day, she placed a small wrapped parcel on the kitchen table. Inside, a new brush, a box of watercolors, and a note that said, "When you're ready." The following morning, Margaret stood in front of the studio door. She hadn't opened it in years. It smelled of dust and old turpentine. The windows were smeared, and the easel leaned tired in the corner like an abandoned dream. She ran her hand along the cracked wood and felt something stir inside her that hadn't stirred in years. She unwrapped the brush. The first stroke was clumsy, the second hesitant, but by the 5th, something inside her began to breathe again. She painted for hours, unaware of the passing time. She painted through tears, through laughter, through every shade of memory that poured from her. She painted a portrait of the apple tree, the crooked limbs reaching like old arms, tired and strong. She painted the ocean, wild and full of secrets. And finally she painted herself, not as she was but as she felt, luminous, weathered, open. For the first time in years, Margaret felt the pulse of her own aliveness. She wasn't waiting anymore. She wasn't fading. She wasn't the last chapter in a book someone had stopped reading. She was still writing, still dreaming, still creating. As the seasons turned, so did she. She began painting every day. She wrote letters to her children instead of just replying to theirs. She invited neighbors in for tea. She even started displaying her paintings in the community center downtown, where a small plaque now read, "Margaret Prescott, heart reopened." She wasn't trying to become young again. She was becoming something far more powerful. fully, unapologetically herself. In the quiet of the night, in the soft hush of her home, Margaret often stood at the window in her shawl, brush in hand, tea cooling beside her. And she would smile. Because it wasn't too late. It had never been too late.